Before we can start building our model, we need to load in some reference images that maybe we can use as a tracing guide, something that we can build from. Now, if you're following along with my Hammerhead Shark project, I'm actually supplying you guys with a reference image that you can use as a backdrop image, a tracing guide inside of your three-dimensional scene. And as a reminder, you don't have to follow along. You don't have to make a Hammerhead Shark. It just has to be some sort of basic ocean animal. And I wanted to show you how we can import that backdrop image into Blender and then use it as a guide for us when placing our three-dimensional shapes. It's really easy. I'm just in a default empty Blender scene here, nothing too fancy. And we're going to start by going into object mode and then going into this add button. And inside this add button, we have an image area. Now, we're going to do a background image, or excuse me, a reference image, not a background image, a reference image. Now, these reference images are not going to be rendered, which is pretty cool. So I'm going to go into the location that I've saved this file on my computer. Here it is, and voila, there it is. Let's turn off my cube so you can see it real fast. And there it is. There's the basic drawing of my shark that I've made and I've given to you guys. But when I load it in, check it out. It's been aligned to the screen space, the orientation of the frame of my computer, my viewport, and not necessarily to my scene space, as it says. It's at this weird angle. And that's by design. Blender is going to do that. Now, with this object selected, either in the outliner or in the three-dimensional scene, this little object, this little tab, the Item Properties tab in our Properties panel, is going to show you all the rotation angles for this object itself. Now, this is a picture of my shark from the side, so I need to kind of get this back to a scene space orientation. I don't want it at this weird angle, so I think I'm just going to go in and zero all three of these channels out real fast, and then voila, we're up and running. Okay, now, which axes do I need to rotate this image along to ensure that I'm positioning it correctly to the left side of my scene itself? And there are a couple easy ways of doing this. Of course, naturally, you could just kind of guess, but I like a little bit more accuracy than guessing. So let's do this. Let's start exploring for a second the different views inside of our scene itself. If you go into this View pull-down menu at the top of your viewport, down here at the bottom, you have this Toggle Quad View, which I find to be an incredibly helpful environment because it's going to label, it's going to divide your viewport into 4 quadrants, and then it's going to label each one of these viewports to a specific view. So we're looking at our scene from the top, we're looking at our scene from the front, and this one over here is the right. We can see the label here. And this is going to help us determine how we need to rotate this object to get the result that we're after. Because I want to see my shark in this right view over here. Now, is it that way? Nope, not that way. But maybe it's a 2-step operation here. Maybe I got to do 90 degrees that way, and then 90 degrees, on the z-axis as well. Voila. There it is. I like that. That's pretty cool. So that's really helpful. Let me show you another way of getting to this exact same end result. I'm actually going to delete this. Bye-bye. And we're going to start over. Now, and I'm going to go return to my View pull-down menu. And I'm going to, once again, toggle my quad view. Now remember, when we first imported this reference image into the computer itself, it oriented the image according to the orientation of my screen inside of the three-dimensional scene. Well, what if the orientation of my screen already matched the orthographic perspective that I want to load this image into? Basically, what I'm saying here is, what if we're already looking at the right view inside of my scene versus this perspective view? Well, we can do that pretty quickly by returning to this View pull-down menu. And now let's load up the right view. Now, if you look real carefully here, you can see that the grid is suggesting that we're still infusing a tremendous amount of perspective inside of the scene, and you'd be correct because you still are. This little button right here is going to remove all of the perspective from your scene and switch to an orthographic view. Aha, this is looking a little bit more like what we're after. Let's try this again. Add image, reference image. There's my shark. Let's load it in, and voila, It's already in, ready to rock and roll. If I was to orbit, looks good. Let's put the perspective back in. Yep, that looks good. Let's toggle our quad view again. See if it's working. Yep, it looks good down here. Life is good. I'm a happy camper. One of the things that I would really recommend that you get comfortable doing is going in and memorizing all of these keyboard shortcuts for all of the different orthographic views. They're number pad specific. And if you look real carefully, you can see the keyboard shortcuts just to the right there. Number pad 7, 1, 2, or 1, 3, and 7. That's going to help you out. Some folks like working in this quad view. Some folks like this, just staying in this big view and then just changing the view based off of the number pads. Now, if we remove the perspective, it gets a little bit more impactful. Here it is from the right. Here it is from the front. Here it is from the top. I want you to notice that as I orbit around, as I cruise around through all of these scenes, all these views, it's changing the badge. So we always get a good understanding. There's the top. Here's the front. It's pretty cool. Here's the right view. You can hold down the command key or the control key and hit command 3 to go from left to right. It's pretty cool, very helpful. Makes working with these images very fast and very easy. Okay, so this is starting to look pretty good. I'm pretty pleased with how all of this is beginning to work. If we were to add in a small cube, though, you're going to see the next big problem that we have when working with reference images is that they're not transparent. We can't see through the image to the entirety of the cube. So we need to do some additional adjustments to our reference image so that it really can become a critical part of our 3D modeling process. And luckily for us in Blender, it's wicked easy to do this. The first thing that we need to do is make sure we got our reference image selected. Mine's called empty. If we open up the empty object, you see that there's the actual image itself. Maybe we should give this a good name real fast. Let's just call this shark image. There we go. That way our outliner is nice and clean. And with this object selected, I'm going to go to this property panel right here, the image property panel, because there's some really cool properties in here that's going to make it a little bit more helpful for us when using this image as part of our modeling process. Now, check this out. I think this is pretty cool. We can turn off this image when we're looking at our scene through a perspective viewport. So if I was to hit the 3 key on my number pad and remove the perspective, then the image is going to show up, which is pretty cool. In addition, if I was to go into the toggle quad view, now the reference image is only ever going to show up in these viewports down here, and we're not going to see it in this perspective view of my 3D scene. So that's pretty cool. You can also flip it so that you only see it in perspective and then you don't see it in the orthographic viewports. I think that's pretty cool. Personally, I like having this perspective option turned off. That way, I always have one viewport where I'm just seeing the model and I can use my reference image to help me lay out all of my shapes pretty quickly. Now, to make it transparent, let's just do this just for time being here. Turn off my quad view. Okay. And turn it back on inside of my perspective view. To make it transparent, the last thing that we need to do is go into this opacity option. We need to turn it on. Now we can lower the opacity. I want to lower it significantly to make it transparent. Now we can see through that background image, that reference image to the background of my 3-dimensional scene, which is pretty cool. However, we still have one small problem. If you look very carefully, the cube is blocking the details of the picture. We can see the green front of my hammerhead shark over here, but this entire center section of the hammerhead shark is being completely occluded by the cube. You can easily see that if we were to look at our scene from the right. Where's the hammerhead shark where the cube is? Well, luckily for us, there's one final change that we can make to the reference image, and that involves going back into the item properties, this gold cube. And specifically, we need to go into visibility. I had it wrong. It is in the viewport display properties, and we need to enable in front. Now, why didn't that turn on? It should have turned on. Yeah, it should have turned on. Let's do it again. It is doing it, but we're not seeing exactly what I want. Let me return to my item properties here real fast. That's because I have to do it on the right object, Pat. I was on the wrong object here. Yeah, I was on the cube, not the shark. Many apologies. Not the reference image. It is the in front button. There it is. I just had the wrong cube or the wrong object selected. My apologies. So you got to go into the reference image and make sure under the viewport display in front is turned on. And now we can see the entirety of our reference image at any time inside of our three-dimensional scene. So there's a couple things that you need to make sure you do when working with reference image. Make sure you're aligning it to the correct viewport. For me, for this shark image, we want to see it through the right view. This is the front of the shark. This is the rear of the shark. This is the front of the scene. This is the rear of the scene. So we got everything aligned correctly, which is pretty cool. On the Item Properties tab for the image, make sure you're going into Viewport Display, turning on in front, and then in the Image Properties, you can turn on the opacity or lower the opacity to make it transparent and for you to see through your reference images. These reference images are fantastic because now we have a tracing guide for all of our simple shapes for our three-dimensional object.